who, after being also a successful entrepreneur and having had a public life, is now based from Indonesia. Will also help us reflect on this crisis from Asia. And I will myself, I'm Gabrielle Gauthey, based in France. Right now, with the lockdown, working from home, but for a big firm called Total. And I will tell you a little bit more afterwards. Perhaps we can have a few words of introduction. I let perhaps Armen introduce himself, and then Sandiaga. Armen, a few words about where you are now.
Thank you, Gabrielle. It's really a pleasure and honor being in your company again. We've worked together on so many different platforms, and now we've never done this way. When we're actually sitting together, you are somewhere in France and I am somewhere in Armenia, and we're doing this type of conference together, having a conversation about current affairs, but also what the world is going to look like tomorrow. I'm in Armenia now. I'm in Yerevan, in the capital of Armenia. As Gabrielle, you just mentioned, I am heading the Foundation for Armenian Science and Technology. It's an organization that is helping produce an ecosystem that drives scientific advancement and technological innovation in Armenia and beyond. So we do a lot of work in deep technologies and scientific verticals, specifically in artificial intelligence, biotechnologies, advanced materials, and robotics. I'll leave it here because we would also want Sandiaga to be well.
Okay, Sandiaga, if you can perhaps introduce yourself.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for me here from Jakarta, Indonesia. My name is Sandiaga Salahuddin Uno, and people call me Sandy. I was an entrepreneur by accident because during 97-98 Asian financial crisis, I lost my job, and by sheer accident and out of desperations, I started a financial consulting firm with a couple of friends of mine, focusing on helping companies to restructure their balance sheets in the aftermath after the Asian 97-98 crisis. That small firm that I started today actually grew to be one of the largest investment company in Southeast Asia, employing around 30,000 people. And we invest across sectors, including oil and gas and clean energy. We also invest in technology and infrastructure, telco infrastructures. I left the private sectors to move into the public sectors in 2016. I contested and successfully ran for the gubernatorial and vice gubernatorial elections for Jakarta in 2017. After a year serving at the City Hall, I was nominated as the candidate for vice president in the last year's election, the 2019 elections. Obviously, I lost, and that's why I'm available. If I win, I would not be available for this call. So here I am back on a gardening leave. I'm starting a small platform for social entrepreneurship on job creations, as well as focusing on investing in the clean infrastructures, clean energy. So that's my brief bio. Thank you very much, Gabrielle and Armen, for inviting me to be in this very, very interesting webinar.
Thank you very much, Sandiaga and Armen. As of myself, my first prize is to be member of the board of the Foundation Fondation Arménienne for Science and Technology. I've known Armen for a few years, working on how digital could change the life of people, especially in development, in health, in education. While I was at the executive committee of a big digital firm, which was Alcatel-Lucent at the time, I had several roles in the telecom industry, both in business and in the public sector. I was at the board of the French regulator, and I was the vice chair of the European regulators in telecom. And I had a lot of contacts with Asia and also the US in this field. I have been a little bit in helping ministers, especially opening up the telecom sector to competition. And after having spent a few years coming back to invest for my country, as I was heading the investments for Caisse de dépôt, which is a sort of French sovereign fund to develop the country in public-private partnerships in all areas of infrastructure, transport, telecom, energy. That's where I learned how energy was really so vital, but also small and business impact companies and smart cities. I decided to move to another sector and to make things change in one of the very well-known company that is one of the biggest polluters, accused of being the biggest polluter, that's Total, which is an oil and gas company. But what is less well-known is that it's a very fast-moving company in renewables, in new energy, in clean energy, and also has an urgency to move and to switch. And I'm heading these activities, which is called carbon neutral businesses within Total, which is both for energy efficiency, the innovation of Total, but also the sinks, carbon sinks, nature-based solutions, investing heavily in forests. We were one of the most heavy investors in nature-based solutions. You wouldn't believe that from an oil and gas company, but that's how it is. And of course, hydrogen. So few new energies for the future. Now, I would like to organize our panels with around a few topics. The topic is mainly recovery and how do we see the recovery, mainly in the industrial sectors that we know best of, but how do we also see the role of governments dealing with that? We're not going to talk about the medical aspect of this crisis, although it's very important. And perhaps the first thing is, I will ask each of the panelists and try to answer myself, is what have you seen and what are the lessons from the reaction of the governments and the sector, the support, and what are they trying to do best? And then how do we see that from our industry point of view? So the first perhaps round of question is, what are you seeing from the governments and from the recovery plans that are emerging? What is in for the areas of the world you are in and for your industries? Perhaps Sandiaga, you can, from your experience from public and private, how do you see governments handling this in the region you know best? We don't hear you, Sandiaga. I don't hear you at least. Okay.
Very, very good questions, Gabrielle, and it's too early to tell at the moment because this is unprecedented crisis that we're facing. If you allow, I have prepared a deck, not too long, maybe 2 or 3 slides that I want to quickly flip through to sort of like tee off our discussions today, which relates to your questions in terms of how specifically we're dealing with this pandemic and things how to move forward. So with your Is it okay, Gabrielle?
Yeah. Go ahead. Sure, Sanjay.
All right. So basically, what I would sort of like term this fast. We need to innovate very fast as a result of this crisis. What we're seeing here is a very unprecedented situations. And the funny thing, it's all over the world. 200 countries, 3 million people plus are affected by this pandemic. And the funny thing about this conference call is that you represent Western Europe and probably French-speaking world. Armen's represent the Americas and probably Central Europe, and I represent Asia. All of us are basically affected. But I want to talk more in particular about Indonesia. It's the largest country in Southeast Asia, whereby the economy is driven 99% by SMEs. Job creations is 97% of SMEs, and 60% of the GDP is contributed by SME. You look at this curve before, how this recession curve is going to take shape in the next few weeks. So we are early in this curve, and I think we are anticipating that hopefully, if we deal with the health crisis with the right policies of territorial lockdown, Indonesia has moved rather fast recently in terms of putting the territorial quarantine. We will see, hope will be a much more flattened in terms of downward recession curve. Learning where we are at the moment is we just need to test. I would term it 3 T's: test, trace, and treat. So if you look at this, we have very limited testing capacity at the moment, and we're ramping up. So this is how we should innovate, how we could get some social innovations in order to help each other to have a much better testing capacity. And PCR by far is the gold standard. So everybody's ramping up while we're waiting for the vaccine. This is a social innovations. It's a picture of me today in the morning, whereby I visited a small initiative by the group of volunteers that I'm heading now. Over the last 5 days, we have tested 3,000 Jakartans for the COVID-19 virus, and people who got the positive indications will be escorted to the nearby hospitals, while majority of the people who are tested negative, they would go back with the food supplies. And this is how people to go out for testing. Another innovation you mentioned about the winners. The winners are basically local herb suppliers to boost your immunities. Now we just realized that there are actually ways for us not to just rely on imported vitamins, but there are also traditional plants, herbal plants that grow so well in Indonesia and could be used to boost your immunity. So these are clear winners. Of course, the losers are the transportation business and travel, the hospitality, but the pharmacies, e-commerce, new clean technologies, clean infrastructures are clear winners in this pandemic. Where we are here, we need to move towards, I guess, what would I call a quadruple P: public, private, people, partnership, including the academics, in terms of how we could work together better. We cannot just rely on government. Government needs to facilitate and become co-creators of innovations. Private sectors will lead, and I guess communities will also need to participate. These are the stages we are in. For businesses, obviously we're in the first two, I guess, the cycle, the two brackets that we're very early in the cycles, whereby just pandemic began. Indonesia is now adapting to new normal. And actually we're reaching a peak in the next couple of weeks. So we just need to be calm. The storm is coming. And then we just have to survive through ecosystems. And this is the ecosystem that we're trying to build through technology. And that's why I'm very interested to have this session talking to you and Armen. What would be the new normal? And post-COVID-19, what type of industries that we need to redevelop? Should we think about the renewable energy? Should we go into carbon neutral industries? And other new normals. We were talking earlier, Jakarta's traffic is much nicer now compared to when Armen was here a couple of months ago. This is a new normal. Wearing a face mask like this is a new normal. And this is spurring local small medium enterprise to produce, switching from making traditional clothing to face masks and PPEs. What are the new normals? The other new normals are basically more how do we survive through ecosystems. Should we continue to build coal-fired power plant? Maybe not. Maybe we should switch to solar and wind turbine and stuff like that. So I'm very interested to discuss with you guys also on what would be the new normals coming out from this COVID-19. So finally, that's my presentations. Terima kasih is thank you in Bahasa. Stay home, stay safe, and don't forget, you could be stay home. You could continue to stay home, but you have to exercise, because if you exercise, your body immunity will improve, and get some sun also, although just around your block, and making sure that you stay optimistic. I'm sure the storm will pass through. I'm really thankful for this opportunity to talk with you guys, and I'll switch it back to you, Gabrielle. Thank you very much.
We can't hear you, Gabrielle.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Thank you very much, Sandiaga, and we'll make a second round to be with you on how you see the new future and the new world compared to the old one. Armen, perhaps you can say a few words of how you have viewed because you of course you're based in Armenia, but you have a deep experience also of other parts of the world, especially the US. How you have viewed countries handling the crisis before we step to what are your views on the recovery?
I think
especially the economic field.
Yeah. One element that remains true, I think, for any government is the reactive nature of this, right? And it's not to the fault of governments. You didn't have an episode of this nature at this scale for many governments to be prepared somewhere. I mean, if you think of how, for instance, Taiwan has handled it almost masterfully, right? But they were also predisposed. They were exposed to SARS some 15, 20 years ago, and that was educational for them. So they knew exactly what to do, and they very quickly, they locked down, and they did all the right things for them to stay ahead of the pandemic. If you look at the government here in Armenia, or if you look at the U.S. governments, you know, there's a lot of differences, but there's also similarities in terms of, again, reactive approach. This is what's happening. It's peaking. Transmission is very high, so we need to do certain things that are unusual. It's at a cost of almost killing an economy for you to keep the people healthy. So there are consequences that come with that. It's also very difficult decisions to make for the government. For the American government, for instance, it's even more difficult only because you're not one state. You know, you're 50 states that have their own intricate ways of governing, their intricate ways of handling healthcare issues, economic issues, and also their constituencies are markedly different. You know, if you look at the United States, how people think and behave on the coast is very different than mid-America. So all of those elements that need to be taken into consideration. I would say, you know, what Sandiaga was pointing, the quadruple helix is an interesting approach, right? Getting all of these actors involved, getting all these stakeholders involved. This is an important way of driving this forward, including academia, including public sector and the government. There's still a lot of unknowns. We don't know what we're dealing with. We don't, you know, we continuously talk about peaks and waves, meaning, you know, it's going to come in, it's going to peak out, and then it's all going to get better. But what if it's a mountain range, right? Meaning this is one of the peaks that you're experiencing. And the actual peak is far away, right? So you're dealing with Himalayas rather than Mount Fuji, for instance. So things of that nature are unknown for the government as well, you know, and until you have such things as you have a vaccine in place and you have herd immunity, these two things, one or the other, I think you have really a challenging environment to govern regardless where you are, whether in Indonesia, France, Armenia, or United States.
Thank you, Armen. Perhaps I can say a few words about how I've viewed this. First of all, the crisis was a revelator that of the one planet we live in. The speed at which the virus spread all over the planet, the pandemic, the global pandemic, just showed us that there were no boundaries and no frontiers for this such a thing. So that's a revelator of you know, the global world we live in. And at the same time, I think it's a great revelator of it's paradoxical because a lot of countries have pulled back on them, you know, sort of experience a drawback on their own territory. So saying now we must handle this ourselves, and they have handled it in very different ways. So the crisis is also a revelator of existing divisions in the world that would perhaps that have been revealed, come up to the world. For instance, the drop of leadership of the USA over the world, and the fact and the revelator of the sort of difficulty to handle national security issues and health issues. Second, the revelator of the split in Europe and the hesitation and the time taken by governments to take decisions and no unique decisions. Some of the countries were closing their frontiers in Europe, some others not. So it was a sort of, you know, higgledy-piggledy manner, handling the crisis not as a whole, you know, altogether. It has shown, of course, the rise of China, dealing that with great authority and in a way that a lot of countries would not have accepted. I mean, the authoritarian way of China dealing with the crisis. And then the way of new actors popping up in a very sometimes awkward time, but trying to do things on their own, Brazil, India, Turkey. The drop of interest of the world for developing countries. I mean, it's everybody in time of crisis is sort of drawing back on its own economy. So that's also something that is quite striking. Second thing, it's a comeback in all countries. The first step, but I think there will be a third one. The third step is the comeback of the state. I mean, there is no debate in France, whereas there's always a debate, always been a debate in the place of the state in Europe in the economy. I have not seen one single newspaper for instance, the transport industry, Air France is almost is in a big crisis. Now the state has decided to step back in the equity of national champions. Now that could not have been imagined, you know, and there were huge debates about this, the state stepping back, doing certainly PPPs, but not intruding in the equity of companies. It's coming back without any debate. So the virtues of free trade are just in the backyard, and it's the debate is unemployment, is safe national champions, and also what we see is the importance of local, of regional, and of handling things locally in the first step. And of course, because those who suffer the most are either in some areas, the transport, the tourism with the event. I think we'll talk about this later. The event industry and you know, this type of is suffering a lot, and also the small local services that had to shut down, restaurants and things like that. You know, and there will be a lot of a huge economic crisis, because as Sandiaga said, SMEs have handled the crisis, or at least the majority of the SMEs, not all, have handled the crisis it's far worse for them than for big companies that have liquidity and have time to see. Let's face it, and it's still not over. Now, I think in the third phase will come where we'll see. I'm still on because of this huge crisis that will come, and the value opportunities will be perhaps more positive in the third round of questions. But let's face it, there will be a huge economic crisis, and we are preparing. We're getting, and states are getting prepared for that. I think the third part will reveal us that we will not be able to solve it without collaboration, without G20, without IMF, without some help from an international collaboration on research to find a vaccine, to find the virus, around collaboration in research, an increased intricacy of But I think it's something. There is a paradox. I think this crisis is a real revelator of existing divisions and weaknesses in our world. Now, perhaps my second round of questions is what, to all of you, and I will try and answer, what impact do you see on the various sectors, and who do you see, of course, as winners and losers before we come to the recovery? Perhaps Sandiaga, you touched already a little, Sandiaga, you touched already a little bit on some of it, but where do you see in your country, because there will be losers in this crisis, but there will be also opportunities. But no doubt some sectors are suffering more than others. Perhaps you can say a word about that.
Well, potential winners, and actually now the clear winners in the last 1.5 months are basically the pharmaceuticals business, the healthcare sectors. I am so fortunate that right before I left my investment firm to go into the public sector, we made some investments in these particular sectors. The clear winners also are the food, food supplies, providing basic staples. The clear winners are the e-commerce, which is now serving the basic necessities of the populations of Indonesia. The clear winners are the IT business. And this is like, I guess we have to accelerate our adoptions to the era of Industrial 4.0. Now we're working from home, so any type of services and products that supplies and support working from home is booming now. In Jakarta, it is very hard to get a webcam. If you wanna order a webcam, you cannot find it. Speakers, Wi-Fi. We have 150 million internet users, and during this time, Actually, I want to also say hi to the Facebook audience. About 600 Facebook audience. The last time I checked, who's following, it's very late, 10:30 in Jakarta now. But these are the areas that we see potential winners, especially also traditional herbs are potential winners. Cybersecurity providers, potential winners. We have so many times what we call Zoom bombing, whereby we were in the Zoom sessions and there are intruders coming. So cybersecurity is going to be the potential winners. Clean energy, definitely potential winners. The stuff that you are doing, carbon neutral, is going to be, because people are now starting to think we need more sustainable practices in terms of how we make sure our economy is growing in the future post COVID-19. Potential losers, definitely the airlines now, but if this COVID-19 is over, there will be pent-up demand. People will travel like crazy because especially, but they will have to start getting used to social distancing. So I guess prices will have to be also adjusting to the new normal. It may be more expensive for people to travel. And I guess hotels and hospitalities are kind of in potential losers at this time around. But going forward with the right type of approach, I think they're going to bounce back. I'm hoping for a V-shaped recovery, not too deep and not too wide in terms of the time elapsed. So yeah, I'm an entrepreneur by training. So I'm actually see glass half full rather than half empty. It's tough time now. A lot of people are really suffering, but I guess there are silver lining, and there will be lesson learned from this crisis. Gabrielle.
Thank you very much, Sandiaga, for these answers. When you say that the transport, that we will travel again like mad, well, we'll see. We'll see if we, a company like us is rethinking the way that it was sending its employees all over the world without thinking and without, about also the carbon footprint of these air travels. So I think what we have in mind is to be much more cautious, even after the crisis, on sending people all around the planet, which for some travels that were perhaps not as justified as, and the use of these, of these Teams and Zoom and events, I think will be increased. So there might be a little less traveling than from big companies like ours than in the past.
I completely agree with you. I used to be from the financial sectors, whereby we do regular roadshows. We go meet investors in person to Europe, to America, and we travel like crazy. But now, looking back, we may not need to travel to New York for just like a day and a half. We could do it as efficiently through this technology. So you are absolutely right, and I think there will be major rethinking about people mobilities going forward. But in terms of like tour and travel business, there will be some moderations, but I think they will have to bounce back, because that's the creative side of the sectors that will, I guess, will help to support those industries.
Armen, what are your views on the winners and losers of especially in the perhaps in Armenia, but also in other countries that you know well?
Yeah, I would largely I would concur with both of you on the selection of areas that would see a decline and a selection of areas that would see an uptick. I would say, I would pick several industries as industries that will be in decline, or otherwise you call them losers. I would say commercial airspace, aerospace, leisure, tourism. So this is going to get a big hit, and I would say the recovery is going to take an indefinite time. I think not until a vaccine is in place. For instance, airlines in the U.S. have parked more than 2,800 planes. And if I'm not mistaken, the airline industry overall around the globe has lost over $300 billion this year already. This is the statistics by International Air Transport Association. I was just looking at that a couple of days ago. So commercial airspace is going to, I'm with you on this, Gabrielle. You mentioned that even in Total, you're rethinking how you're going to be using your business travel as well. Travel is also going to suffer, just general travel, not business, in the short term, until at least we flatten the curve. I think that will take a hit. Oil and gas, and to a lesser degree, even energy, electric power, natural gas. This is temporary, but if other sectors are experiencing decline, there is really no need. Sandiaga mentioned that the traffic in Jakarta has eased up, and I remember, if anyone has gone to Indonesia, and especially trying to get around in Jakarta, is one of the biggest challenges I think that humanity has ever faced. It's really a tough place to get from one place to another. And so those types of ease up on the roads, or major manufacturing or industries, when they're in decline, naturally you're not using as much energy. So oil and gas, it's also temporary, but it's going to take a hit. Real estate, I think for commercial real estate, it will be a deeper impact than maybe buying homes or rentals and what have you. But still, until full economic activities are restored, people are not going to have money. They're not going to have free cash for them to, or liquidity for them to invest in real estate, or to be able to actually unload them, right? So for them to be able to sell them is also going to be a difficult thing. I don't know, apparel, fashion, luxury goods. You're not on Fifth Avenue, you're not on Rodeo Drive any longer. At least you're not in the same capacities for you to be spending awful lot of money. And then also, you're most of the time, I don't know about you guys, I'm in my PJs at my house, right? It's very comfortable. They don't need to be silk. They don't need to be made by, by one of these big designers. It's, if I have something that's worth $5 and, it suits me, it's fine. So I think these areas are going to have an immense challenges for them to recover. Now, but as to your point, there's also industries I want to say that will draw more attention. I think Sandy mentioned medicine and pharmaceuticals. I want to just encapsulate, I want to say biomedicine and biotechnology. I think until such time when we feel secure, we're confident that we can deal with our health and physical insecurities, these areas are going to prosper. I don't know if you're following some of the things that are happening in that space. Incidentally, one of our co-founders of FAST, one of the co-founders of FAST is also a co-founder of Moderna, and the chairman of Moderna Pharmaceuticals is the company in the United States that is getting into the second phase of testing the vaccines. It's the most advanced of all the solutions that exist out there. There's I think 78 or 80 or maybe even more now, but Moderna is on the forefront of it. And Noubar Afeyan very well. He's given several interviews, and he was talking about this in general during one of our last webinars. I want to also go to AgTech. Global supply chains have disrupted, right? So there's also some sort of a nature of isolationism. Think of what's happening in the United States, or self-reliance when you're locking everything down. You're not expecting, you're not bringing people in. In Armenia, for instance, Armenia is a landlocked country, has 4 neighbors only, and 2 of them not in good relationships. So your supply chain is really reliant on ease of transportation going back and forth. So border and travel concerns are going to be a huge deal. They may force nations to adopt national level policies to be able to produce enough for self-sufficiency. And these are the things, you know, you thought probably in early part of 20th century, but after World War II, you stopped thinking about this. But situations of this nature are going to enforce this. You know, I recently saw that pork, chicken, beef plants in United States are forced to shut down. But even shutting down a plant, a large plant like Tyco's, for even short period of time, this is millions of kilos of meat that disappear from supply chain. And people are expecting to go to stores for them to be able to, you know, it's like, it hasn't arrived, but it really depends how long the pandemic is going to last and how fast we're going to. But these are areas that you can invest. Ag tech, you know, there is going to be a lot of, I think, interesting solutions. And last I'll mention, and then I'll come back to you, it's educational technology. It's, I mean, imagine like masses of young people, masses of people around the world have shut down. The entire traditional educational system has been paralyzed. Until recently, online education was considered a fringe, supplementary to whatever is happening in physical environment. But as the three of us are experiencing now, this is the only way for us to be together, for us to communicate. So I think there is a lot of opportunities. So I'll say, you know, there's a lot of opportunities in biomedicine, biotechnologies, ag tech, and ed tech.
Thanks, Armen. I think we'll come back to education and universities because we have a few questions on this. What will be their long-term impact and on their renewal of education, perhaps, of this crisis? I think it will have some effect. For me, what I note from here in Europe is, of course, the increased importance of digital. Everybody notices that, even in health, e-health. Doctolib is a very popular platform. It was not, it made a boom, of course, within this crisis, and local doctors who saw that people no longer daring to go out, and so these e-health platform, e-consultation have massively increased, of course. So this will change also the way we will live later. What has the importance of local provision of food. This will have a big impact, and what you consume and how you consume and where is the food you consume, where does it come from? So you no longer buy strawberries coming from the other part of the planet at the wrong period of time. And I can tell you what was a tendency before is now a massive impact in the population. Because eat locally, make yourself safe, sustainable with local provision of and how this has massively will change habits of people. So food industry, of course, biotech and the importance of research and of having this, I absolutely agree with that. Now, tourism was for Europe, for France especially, a huge sector of development. In fact, it was a sector in which, as an investor, I invested a lot to renew the old real estate in France, the castles, the old hostels, and the like. There is a big concern about that, and probably for Indonesia it was also a big concern. But you have a mass of internal tourism to develop, perhaps that will save you from the problem that we are facing in Europe, which was the massive discovery of Europe by Asian tourists, you know, being Chinese, Indonesian, Indian. What is that going to look like? Or are they going to stay more at home and discover their own? So that's a big concern, you know, or are they going to continue to travel? And it was a rising industry and very quickly developing industry in our old continent. Big concern about that. What is it going to look like? And of course, the last thing is are we going to see the relocation of some industries that had dedicated to China or to Asia, and that are trying to relocate. And this is a big move, I know, in the US. Now it's starting, and I know we have a big companies reeling that are having plans of no longer outsourcing even to fast developing countries, but relocating their provisions and the industry. So this also might have an effect on some of the companies that we know best. Now, perhaps I would like to rebound on Sandiaga, what you said about clean and green, and I can say a word about that. And is this move towards more sustainability, which sometimes is not cheaper, is more expensive. Renewable energy is for us more expensive than the like. So there is a paradox there. Some people say the crisis will cut all the efforts that people have done to switch to cleaner energy. Even if the people have seen the blue sky of Jakarta, and I can imagine what that is, because the last time I came, it was indeed a headache. And people are enjoying the blue sky of Paris and the like. But I mean, moving to clean energy sometimes takes time and is more costly for people than fossil fuels and the like. So how do you see that? Do you see an increased move towards more sustainability? And I must say, I have another question for you, coming probably from someone from Indonesia, who would like you also to elaborate after the clean part on how is the recovery, how are local resources going to be empowered to overcome the crisis, especially in Indonesia? If you can also elaborate on this question, because it's a specific question from our audience for you. So perhaps on the two questions on the green revolution, is that going to move forward, even if sometimes it seems are more expensive, and on the recovery in Indonesia? Thanks.
I am 100% a big believer now, because I've invested in various sectors in the natural resources sectors. I had invested in the past in coal, oil and gas, and most recently I created a platform with a couple of very young millennials in focusing on clean infrastructures, clean energy, new and renewable energies, ESG, environmental, social, governance compliant fund, managing in third-party investors as well as family office. There's a growing interest in investing in the space. I know it's going to be a big challenge when the oil price is almost zero. And people will say that, why would we need to invest? Because the key is not to look at it from a cost perspective. We've seen how we've gone through cycles, and if we're not switching the focus now to clean energy, the green energy, as well as green jobs, because at the end of the day, we need to provide jobs for Indonesia. And I think for Indonesians to focus on a more sustainable, long-term green jobs are actually more attractive. And I'm speaking from my past experience. And when you live through cycles of various crises, you will see that a more robust investments in terms of providing very stable return for investors are the sustainable and clean investments, or clean and green investments that you're making. And stuff like waste to energy, these are new innovations whereby cities will have to adopt. When I was serving at the City Hall, Jakarta produced 7,000 tons of municipality waste every day, and it's actually going to the landfill. If we turn it to waste to energy, it's going to be very it's a brilliant way on a public-private partnership. So I am a big believer now that we need to switch, looking at it more from the sustainable point of view. But yeah, it will be a big challenge, because a lot of people will say, hey, energy is so cheap while you are investing in a more in a much costlier sectors. But I think this is in the best interest of not now, but maybe 10, 15, 20 years later. The millennials, which is now form part of the majority of our demography, demands it. My 20-year-old daughters, they were the one forcing me to relook and divesting from our not so friendly investments. So the millennials, because they are dominating, and they would want to make sure that the energy that they are getting are the clean energy. So going to the second questions, which is very interesting. You mentioned how we localize, we personalize, we customize things that we consume. It's happening because what happened when Wuhan COVID-19 started, we had to experience a stop in food being distributed from China. So we rely on garlic imports from China. So our garlic price shot through the roof. And some fruits coming in from China is also not available. So we started looking at, why don't we grow it here? So urban farming, vertical farming, city farming with new technology will take place. And I think people are starting to get more responsible in terms of how they consume, and they want to make sure that they consume local produce. Absolutely right. And I think this is also driven the changes by the millennials, because the millennials now wanted to find out, is it imported stuff? No, I want to have local produce. And this is something that we need to do to empower our farmers. They are 30% of the workforce coming from the farming sectors, 10% of the workforce coming from tour and travel, as well as tourism industry. So we need to rely a lot to, I guess, local tourisms. But if, for instance, France is able to handle this coronavirus, I think the demand is very big from this part of the world to still go to Europe, to still go to Middle East, especially in relations to the performing the pilgrimage, performing the Umrah and the Hajj. It's big market. We have 270 million and one of the fastest growing middle class. And I think it's going to be very, very interesting going down the road. People are customizing, personalizing, localizing their consumptions. They want to, stuff that you wear. They want to make sure also it's local products. It's available now. They just been too entertained or too mesmerized by imported, the French products. Now the bags no longer going to be just Hermes or Chanel, but it will be also local and personalized products. So I guess, yeah, there are a lot of opportunities, and I'm actually quite optimistic post COVID-19 that we will have winners under the new normal situations. Gabrielle.
Okay, thank you, Sandiaga. Armen, what do you see in the reshuffling of supply chain worldwide, and do you also see this rise for local? I mean, you having come back to your country to grow this local industry, how do you see the opportunity? And second, how do you see perhaps the rising interest of the young generations for everything that is sustainable?
I think we need to look at the human mind, how human mind works in the first place. I think the longer we stay in this type of a setup, we're going to adapt to the realities of today, right? And they're going to force us do certain things that we didn't think otherwise would be economically viable, but now they will be, or they would not have been viable for us as individuals because it was not an expected or accepted way for us to do business or for us to socially interact, or other ways. Look, there is, the monetary and fiscal policymakers. They're pulling out all the stuff to keep the economy and citizenry afloat during this crisis. But still, some of the restrictions on the economy are going to last a lot longer than we anticipate. It's if GDP, if the GDP is declining substantially, and one of the worst case, the global GDP declining by 6.5%, GDP of in the United States declining by 8%, over 10% in Europe. When you're experiencing these types of declines, everything gets reshuffled. I think we spoke about farm fields and agriculture. Even if we look at greenhouse effects, agriculture itself or livestock itself is nearly 14 or 15% of all as a contributor to greenhouse effects, and half of it is, I think, methane, which is even worse than if you were just going after the CO2, right? So, but imagine if factories and farm fields were operated by smart robots, for instance. We will experience very little disruption in economic activities. I know you said something in the nature that it's more expensive. I think in the short run it may be more expensive, but even if that's changing. For you to have run, let's say, a solar farm 20 years ago was far more expensive, and it contributed a lot more in greenhouse effects than now, because a lot of the supply chain is also transforming. So I think it's a matter of perhaps decade or 15 years when you bring the opportunity cost to nearly zero when it comes to energy output from traditionals or from fossil fuels versus new technologies. But we're not there yet, right? So we're not there because the demand hasn't really been there. We don't produce these things on scale, nor do we rush to make the next version of it to stay ahead of the competition. The traditional manufacturing facilities, for instance, or farmlands have little incentive to make major infrastructure investments. What for? When the old system works well. But today, it doesn't. So something has to give. And I think technology wins here. And I think this is where the millennials or the new generation are going to look at this and say, you know what, here's an opportunity, because it's going to be massively costly and it's also uncool. And that's very important because you are bothered, or you are incentivized how social media interacts with you, or how they look at you, whether they're looking at you as a social entrepreneur or a constructive entrepreneur versus someone who contributes to the global mess, right? So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities out there. And just one very important thing I think here is there have been a lot of discussion about universal living wage when cost of making goods ends up near zero or zero, and I think we're slowly getting there. So although you're looking at the traditional capitalism and you say this is insane, this looks like socialism, but I think the very nature of capitalism, if it operates correct, is going to lead us to that type of an environment. And I don't think that's going to be the traditionalists to take us there. It's going to be all of these disruptors, all of those entrepreneurs, people like Sandiaga who've broken traditional realities time and time again. And I think many of our listeners who are entrepreneurs, be it in Armenia, Indonesia, France, or United States, I think there is going to be a lot of opportunities for them. Back to you, Gabrielle.
Thank you, Armen. Yes. Let me say a word about how I see things. Well, it's true that there was a move before the crisis, and especially of millennials. I agree with you, Sandiaga. And I also experienced this at home, living with them right now. I have 4 of them between 20 and 29. And it's a headache because they all the time, have their own views on what we should eat, the way we should recycle, the way we should grow salads in the garden, which we're trying to do, and they're putting it into practice. One of my daughters is, by the way, graduated from one of the best universities in France, has dedicated 1 year of her life cycling through France after having traveled through Asia, because she didn't want to travel back that far because of the footprint. Touring around before the COVID, what were the local experiences that made people change their habits and their way of life? and trying to find a way where she could invest her life doing that, either growing things locally or recycling or other things. So it's, I live with her right now. It's not uneasy at all, because I get, challenged all day long about our way of life and what we have done wrong in the life. So, and also at work, as I have the pleasure to lead the investments and the ventures of Total, I can tell you I have the same. I have the same as at home. I mean, young people wanting to invest in recycling and in smart transport, smart energy. But by the way, I'm a little worried about some of the smart transport and the ventures that we have had in this. Of course, some of our ventures are, I don't know whether they will overcome the crisis or not, because there's no transport at all. So, and no need for smart transport right now. But anyway, so there will be some bankruptcies among some ventures. We'll have to face this and to see what we can do. So we're just right now thinking of recovery plans also to help. And some of our ventures in Africa, for instance, we're setting up a recovery fund to help ventures, because they're small companies that had engaged beforehand, even in this green tech and in this smart autonomous transport and the like. I mean, they have to be helped right now, because otherwise they will not overcome the crisis. So we also have to face this. That's apparent it is. Otherwise, what I see also is that we had, as I tell you, we were wondering whether this will, the recovery plans also of governments, whether they will cut because they have no more money. They're going to face our Western governments are going to face huge problems in public finance, while they were already facing it. But I mean, with this crisis, it's not going to make things easier. So are they going to cut all the transition funds that they were, or the PPPs they were engaging to facilitate this move from fossil fuels through gas, through clean energy? We all know that renewables are right now able to have cheaper prices because of size, but they all have been helped at the beginning through purchase agreement with the state or long-term purchase agreements and things like that. Now, what I see is the contrary, which is an increased interest in topics like hydrogen, for instance, which is which is a very old topic, but at the same time, all around the planet, I see a renewed interest to foster the development of what is called green hydrogen compared to blue. Blue is when you capture the carbon from the methane, because you make 10 times more CO2 than when you make 1 ton of hydrogen. But green hydrogen is still 5, 6, 7 times more expensive, and will be before we get size. So this will come through purchase agreements, long-term contracts with the help of some states. And what I see, and I'm happy to see that, is that Europe is engaging in a Green Deal, which is even re-emphasizing this. So that's a long-term view that I agree is something very, very interesting. It's what I see is a reinforcement on batteries, EV charge, fuel cells, on renovation of old buildings that were consuming a lot of energy, as I said, on hydrogen, a lot. I don't know if you see that as well, and how you two view this from where you are. And then perhaps we'll have one last question about education, university, and which is also very important. How will that come out changed by the crisis? Perhaps on these new industries, Sandiaga, and the way you view this.
I think education is one of the industry that's for 100 years have not been disrupted. I have a 8-year-old son. I used to get him ready to school, and then drive him to school, pick him up again, and now he wakes up. He doesn't have to take showers. He just jump and do Zoom home learning. So it's a big disruptions. The classroom, I think, will be somewhat going to be replaced by something more like this. Harvard is now offering online classes for free. So I can get the best of educations in the world, maybe from Sorbonne. I used to travel to Paris to get summer school from Sorbonne. I may not need to travel to Paris anymore. I can get it online. So yeah, I guess not only healthcare, educations will also get disrupted in a major way. But going back to clean and green, there are many questions about clean and green, and that's why I decided, although I'm not going back to my old investment firm, I decided to team up with a couple of friends, and I'm picking the youngest of us all as the leader, and he's a millennial. I said that you lead this effort because you are thinking like millennials, to think about clean and green, and we just started our fund. It's called 2020 because of the visions as well as the year. The 2020 infrastructure development partners will focus on this, and I think I would be really looking into on a very focused basis in order to change the energy landscape of Indonesia, and probably we could be the agents for change, because I see how millennials change on how we consume our food. Because my 2 daughters, they are in the 20s now, are the ones which is I don't really like shark fins, but it's delicacies that a lot of in a Chinese restaurant in Indonesia serve. But we cannot no longer eat that when they were growing up. They say it's cruel. No more shark fin, and you should not, even if it's a public event, to consume that. Foie gras. They said, I know you like French food, but no foie gras anymore for you, because it's cruel on how they do it. So the kids are starting to, the millennials, I would not say kids, but the millennials, these changes in the Indonesian demography will drive the demand for energy, for food, water conservations. We used to be not really thinking about our water. We take our groundwater. Stop. People will now invest in clean water. Wastewater will also need to be treated. So a lot of interesting avenues is going to be coming up for rethinking post-COVID-19. So maybe with that, I end my remarks, and really thank you for the time. I tried to answer some of the questions in the chat, and if there are other questions, I let Armen's team to forward it to me to answer offline. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, Sandiaga. Thank you for sharing your experience, which is very interesting in this period of time, of this move that you have done. Also, like myself, indeed, I've moved from the IT sector and telecom to this green sector, because I really think it's something really vital for our world and for the future of our kids. And Armen, how do you see? Do you want to say one last word about the way you see education, university, because you're also engaged in the future of the youth of your country, and perhaps how you see this crisis as an opportunity to disrupt what had not been disrupted, and perhaps also disrupt some events. You have just done it with this event that we're doing, but we have some questions about the event industry that had really not been disrupted much, and the people flooding to the CES to Las Vegas. It was, I don't know what the footprint of this event is, and but do you think this will also change, because the event industry had not been much disrupted, and more and more experiencing events like the one we're just organizing right now? How do you see that, Armen?
It's an excellent question. I'll cut it short because I know we're over time and need to get to the next things. But very quickly, look, we don't know. We haven't figured this part out. And I'm not only speaking about myself, I'm speaking about, I think, globe. We talk about millennials, but I think now we got to talk about Generation Z, right? So they have, they look at millennials. I mean, we're ancient, right? So they think we're absolute dinosaurs, and they're looking even at millennials differently. So Generation Z is very specific. They don't have too much attention to anything. They don't pay too much attention to anything. They have very short attention to things. And I think when it comes to education, we really got a question as to what's the education today for, right? When it first became formal, official in 17th century, it was serving the needs of the government. And it was very necessary back at that time, 400 years ago, but 450 years ago, we're still using the same model today, which is insane. It's like not much has changed. So we have a big time inflation when it comes to educated people. I mean, it's like printing money over and over and not being able to use. And I think that's what's happening here, right? You have back in the days, if you had a master's degree or a PhD, you immediately would land a job. It's not that you needed to look for a job. You were a part of a conveyor belt. You were there, and you immediately were going to get someplace placed. But today, that's not the case because there is an inflation. So we need to deflate this. And the only way to deflate it, to really understand what is education for. Is it for an individual, or is it to really drive technological advancement forward? If that's the case, if the latter is the case, then types of curriculum that you're using, types of professors that you're using, infrastructure is very different. You don't need the classroom anymore. I mean, just one thing, and I think Sandiaga and both of you will agree, back when we were in classes, right? I remember your class, your fifth grade, you walk into the classroom, your professor, no matter what subject matter you're speaking about, your professor knows the most. There is no question, your professor knows the most. Today, you walk into the classroom, there's nothing your professor can tell you that you cannot Google within 10 seconds. So that changes the dynamic. You're no longer the brightest thing in the classroom, right? So your role as a professor changes. Are you a professor or are you a mentor? You're probably more of a mentor. But if that's the case, you need to go to the classroom is the question, right? Then we go back to technology. The issue is, and I just replied to some of our audience here, that premium virtual meeting solutions like Cisco's telepresence types have a potential of becoming a norm, but it's very expensive. But look how quickly, let's say, Facebook came up with messenger rooms, right? To try to emulate whatever Zoom's success is. But I still think we haven't figured out what is that really medium of a platform that's going to allow education to thrive. And it's not to the fault of us because there was really no need for that. Everything was a fringe. But now I think this is forcing us to come up with something that's going to be a requirement for distance for virtual education, which will also drive meetings. And let's be honest. It's like, let me say something controversial, and I think you'll appreciate this. Between three of us, we attend a lot of meetings, a lot of conferences. Most of them is useless. It doesn't play. It's no longer the same as it was 25 years ago or 30 years ago when you needed to go to those conferences. If you need to network, do you really need to be at a conference with 20,000 people? You're probably better off in trying to have a cold introduction on LinkedIn rather than going to a 20 or 40,000 people meeting. So I think that space is going to be disrupted, especially with COVID-19, and it's due. But now the demand is going to force it. I'll end there, Gabrielle.
Thank you very much, Armen. Now I think it's, I'm not going to be very long because it's we're over time. I agree with you, just to rebound. Of course, we had the pleasure to meet also on some of these conferences, but I can tell you since the crisis, I have been very active also on my LinkedIn, more than I usually are. And I've met many people, especially in my field, in the carbon capture field, for instance, many interesting people with whom I've interacted just, very easily. So you can also find a way to keep open to the world. So it doesn't mean to sort of to relocate and shut yourself in your country house and not see the world. You can see the world from your local window, and your local window is going to be increasingly important as well. That's so it's both the paradox of this crisis, and perhaps on this note, I can say that thank you very much for FAST for having organized this. I think that if we were organizing this in 2, 3, 4 months or 5 months after the crisis, perhaps we had again another view, because I think I had at least an evolving view along all these past weeks, which were perhaps some of the most interesting, difficult but interesting, and that will not leave the world unchanged. And that's what we have tried to exchange between us. So happy to exchange again with you sometime and see what again has changed, because in our evolving world. Thank you very much, Armen and FAST and all the organizers for this very good event. It was a pleasure to meet Sandiaga from my little home in France, to see Indonesia. Great to all of you. Thanks, Armen.
Gabrielle. Thank you for moderating this so masterfully, as always. Appreciate it. Sandiaga, good to see you, my friend.
Thank you, Armen. Merci beaucoup, Gabrielle.
Thank you, Sandiaga. Hope to see you in person, though, one day, perhaps.
Thank you very much.
Good French food, and this region is very well known for its seafood and oysters and wine. It's better to taste under the French sun, but
a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much to all of you, and thank you for the organizers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.